And like I said, to me personally, in most cases, I would prefer it. If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30. This is the same issue that I have playing video games. When I play some of these games at 60 frames per second, they lose that cinematic feel.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Alright, so what's going on, guys? Today we're taking a look at, it's a bit of an older video, but it's where a guy claims that you shouldn't focus on 60 FPS this console generation of the PlayStation 5 Series X and S, despite the fact that we were promised 60 FPS. And actually, we were told we were going to get frame rates we haven't seen before. This video comes from a PlayStation fanboy by the name of Supernova. The video is titled, Why Gamers Shouldn't Focus on 60 FPS Next Console Generation. And by next console generation, he's talking about this console generation. And oh my god, it is the worst video I've ever seen in my life. It literally gave me AIDS. Your title claims that we shouldn't care about 60 FPS, but we were promised 60 FPS. And being promised is a reason enough as to why every single game should be running at a minimum of 60 FPS. When you promise something, you have to deliver it. Oh, and one final thing. I'm watching this video back, like editing it now, and I definitely come across as aggressive towards people who prefer a lower frame rate and better graphics rather than, you know, a higher frame rate and lower graphics. If you're okay with 30 FPS, this isn't an attack against you, but don't get upset at those who expect 60. Anyway, let's go.
Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I've seen so many people over the last months and weeks say that next generation should be defined by 4K 60. Every game should be native 4K, 60 frames per second, that there's no excuse for games not running at 60 frames per second, and that they are going to be very upset if they are not seeing games running at 60 frames per second.
And motherfucker, can you blame them? I mean, yeah, I'm probably going to be pretty upset when my PlayStation 5 is running just as well as my PlayStation 2 did. Can you really blame anybody for being mad in that situation? I mean, we paid extra for these consoles. Dude, we're not even a minute into this guy's video and I'm already, like, actually angry. Like, it's very rare that I actually get mad at these videos, but this guy's legitimately fucking pissing me off. I have a feeling by the end of this video, there's gonna be a hole in my wall somewhere.
And I remember there were a few people that were kind of bitching and complaining when the PlayStation 5 event took place, and they found out that most of the PlayStation 5 games shown were not running at 60 frames per second, but were running at 30 frames per second.
I love how he just classifies these people as bitching and crying. No, they're not bitching and crying. They're upset because their games on this more expensive than ever console are running just about as well as their console they had back in 2000, whenever the PS2 came out. They're upset that they're not seeing any technological advances from the PlayStation 2 to the PlayStation 5 when it comes to frame rate. They're upset because the 9th generation of consoles is running at 30 FPS. I mean, soon enough, we're gonna be at a higher console generation than frame rate, if you guys keep sitting here and defending this shit.
And while more than likely most of the people airing their grievances were just Xbox fanboys,
Yes, everyone who criticizes the PlayStation is just an Xbox bootlicker. It's not like people are fans of PlayStation and they want to see PlayStation do better. I sit here and criticize both PlayStation and Xbox because I like both consoles. However, I'm not satisfied with the frame rate on either consoles. It's not me being a fanboy, it's me being disappointed.
talking shit, I'm sure many of the people were also PlayStation fans thinking to themselves, the PlayStation 5 is supposed to be extremely powerful, why can't it play games at 60 frames per second?
I'll answer that question for you. This hyper focus on graphics. Good graphics does not make a good game. Performance and gameplay is way more important than graphics. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that the graphics can look just absolute dog shit, but I mean, I feel like the industry is way too focused on these hyper-realistic graphics to the point where they care more about that than the actual gameplay and performance. I don't care how well you can render Captain Price's nutsack if the frame rate is really bad and the gameplay isn't interesting. Graphics should come third behind performance and gameplay.
And after the event took place, we actually had a former principal software engineer for PlayStation 5 actually explained to us why many of these games were running at 30 frames per second. And it had nothing to do with limitations of the hardware, and more to do with limitations of TVs and developers' decisions based on the HDR capabilities of those TVs.
Yeah, because I'm sure people are really using TVs out there with lower than 60 Hz refresh rates. That's an absolute fucking corporate lie, and you know it.
I'll read directly from the article what the guy was saying, but just a heads up, it is kind of techie, jarbled nonsense and maybe difficult for you to understand, so I will do my best to explain to you what it is that he's talking about. Matt Hargett points out in a tweet that the problem is not with the console, but with players' TVs. He writes that a typical cheap 4K TV can only do 420 HDR at 4K and 60 Hz, but can push the HDR to 422 at 4K and 30 Hz. Most game developers would rather have their games look good in 4K than have them run at 60 frames per second.
But that's the opposite of what gamers want. Every single poll I see on the internet, every single study I see, shows that gamers prefer a better performance over higher resolution. Why do you think most PC players are still playing on 1080p? Honestly, if you ask me, 4K is a fucking scam. It's not even true 4K, and we're giving up 60 FPS for this, like, fake-ass 4K?
And it seems they must sacrifice one or the other. Developers want their games looking filmic, as Hargett puts it.
Yeah, but here's the thing. We're not watching a film. We're playing a video game. We're not watching Iron Man here. We're trying to play a game. Oh my god, dude. Oh, this is literally making me angry.
And wants more people to be able to experience their games in sharp detail and bright colors.
And games can still look sharp with bright colors at 1440p or 1080p, and most people would pick that with a frame rate of 60 over 4K 30. And if you can't get your game running at 4K 60, then why not do what a lot of games do, and I actually praise them for this, but have the option. Let players choose, would they rather play at 4K 30 or 1440p or 1080p 60?
Now I'm sure you're able to understand most of that, but the parts you probably didn't understand was the 420 and the 422. Now I'm going to link a video I found of someone explaining what these numbers mean in the description, because they're going to do a better job explaining it than I will, but I'm still going to give you like a basic explanation. These numbers refer to what's called color sampling. There's 444, 422, and 420. 444 captures the most color information about a particular image. 422 captures half the amount of information, and 420 captures even less information. So if you're using 422, you're going to have a more detailed and colorful picture than if you're running 420. And according to him, many TVs are not able to run 422 at 60 Hz or 60 frames per second.
So we're sacrificing 60 frames a second for some brighter colors. You gotta be kidding me. So we're gonna run at half the frame rate so we can have some brighter colors on our screen? Jesus Christ. It's almost like these developers don't understand that we want to play our games, we don't want to watch them. I don't care how well your game looks if it plays just about as well as a turd that was just squeezed out of a dog's ass cheeks.
So the developers can either have their games run at 60 frames per second and run 420, which means a less colorful, detailed game, or they can drop it down to 30 frames per second and be able to do 422 and have a much more colorful, detailed picture.
Once again, I doubt very few people out there would prefer to have a slightly brighter picture for half the performance.
The devs are opting to have the better looking game rather than the smoother running game.
Which is the dumbest thing on the planet, because most polls out there show that people prefer better performing games over better looking games. I mean, there's even been studies done on this. I can't find the study, but it was back in like 2015. It proves that people prefer higher frame rates over better looking games.
If that makes sense. He also mentioned the, quote, filmic quality of the games and how developers wanted to maintain that filmic quality. And this is something I try to explain to people all the time, because me personally, there are certain games that I prefer at 30 frames per second and that I believe should be at 30 frames per second.
No game in 2024 on next generation hardware should be locked to 30 frames a second. We are on the PlayStation 5 now. We are not on the PlayStation 2 anymore. I did not go out and pay extra money for this console generation just to get the same performance I had back in the early 2000s. If you want to have a 30 FPS mode with like amazing graphics or whatever, that's fine. But don't force the rest of us to play in your quote-unquote filmic 30 FPS because the rest of us don't appreciate that shit. The rest of us would rather play a game at 60 frames a second that might look a little bit worse instead of this like choppy ass 30 FPS experience.
Bro, you're so full of shit, you're just damage controlling. Both flops, yo.
You can portray people who disagree with you as Xbox fanboys all you want. It doesn't change the fact that what they're saying is true. You are damage controlling for PlayStation right now. You know yourself that your PlayStation 5 should be performing better than your PlayStation 2. And you could sit here and argue, well, it looks better than the PlayStation 2, and you're right, but it doesn't run any better.
Now, your fighting games, racing games, and first-person shooters, those should be 60 frames or up because of the types of games that they are. But games that are supposed to be cinematic, your third-person action-adventure games, your The Last of Us, your Uncharted, games like that, where they're supposed to have a very cinematic feel to them. Those games, for me, look better at 30 frames per second because they have that quote-unquote filmic quality.
Okay, to this guy's credit, at least he acknowledges that first-person shooter games, action games, and racing games kind of require 60 frames a second. I'll give you that small bit of credit there. However, I don't think any game should be locked to 30 FPS, even these like Last of Us style games. Because here's the thing, dude, some people just don't like choppy experiences. You know, add an option for 60 FPS, even if it means bringing the game down to 720p, I'd still pick that over 4K 30. It's insane that I'm here in 2024, begging for some games to get an option to run at 720p, 60 FPS.
Once you increase the frames per second up to 60, they then lose that. They look a little weird. Do they run smoother? Absolutely. But they lose that cinematic movie-like feel.
Here's the thing, a lot of us are here to play games, not watch movies, and we'd appreciate the option to play in 60 FPS, even if it means the game feeling less like a movie.
Same thing with like God of War, for example. God of War has the two modes you can choose from. You can choose from the graphics mode or the performance mode. The second you put it in performance mode and it kicks the game up to 60 frames per second, it's buttery smooth, but it loses that filmic quality. It loses that cinematic feel.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I play God of War. I don't watch it as a movie. I'd prefer to have smoother inputs over a cinematic feel. So I praise God of War for having the option. Those who enjoy the movie-like feel can enjoy their movie-like feel, but those who prefer to have smoother games can enjoy a smoother game. The problem is, a lot of games are coming out nowadays, and they don't offer us the option for a smooth game. We're stuck with this quote-unquote cinematic experience that we just don't like.
And I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to you exactly what I mean using a clip from the Avengers.
He goes on to show a clip of the Avengers and talk over it, and obviously I can't show the clip of the Avengers with him talking over it, so I'm just gonna take his audio and put an image on the screen because I don't want Disney striking my video, so I apologize. Get mad at Disney for having a stick up their ass when it comes to copyright. Kinda reminds me of Nintendo.
Now, something many of you probably do not know is that the movies that we watch every day are only 24 frames per second.
Yeah, and those are movies, those are not games. They're two completely different things, so you can't really compare the two.
When you buy those movie tickets to sit down and watch your summer blockbuster movies at the movie theater of your choice, that movie is only playing in 24 frames per second.
And I think it's completely fine for a movie to play in 24 frames per second because it's not a game. Now, if it were a game playing in 24 FPS, every time you move the camera, the frame rate would just be so, like, visibly low, it would be, like, nauseating to look at. And you'd have a crazy amount of input lag. Whereas in movies, these are not things you have to worry about, so it's not really a big deal when a movie runs at 24 FPS. Once again, we're here to play games, we're not here to watch movies. The last time I checked, it's called the PlayStation 5, not the WatchStation 5.
Same with the clip that you're looking at right now. This clip is from the first Avengers movie, running at 24 frames per second, and nothing about it looks out of the ordinary. It looks like we're watching a movie, right?
Which is not what we're trying to do when we boot up our PlayStation 5. Bro, we try to play games, we don't try to watch them. Oh my god. Oh, you're making me angry, dude.
Like, nothing looks strange, the motions don't look weird, the animations look fine. The CG, even though it's CG, it still feels like we're watching a movie, and it looks like it was filmed with like a movie camera, like a high quality movie camera.
Yeah, and when you go to watch a movie, that's great, like, looks great, but that's not what we want when we play a video game. Playing a video game and watching a movie are two completely different things. It's stupid to compare the two. Alright, he's done showing clips of the Avengers, so we can go back to his video now.
Now, I would love to be able to show you that same clip running right now on the screen in 60 frames per second. But unfortunately, my limited knowledge of how to use Final Cut Pro, since I'm self-taught, is making it so I can't upload clips in 60 frames per second, even though I have the clips saved.
Well, turns out gaming isn't the only thing you have limited knowledge in. You also have limited knowledge in Final Cut Pro.
To my computer in 60 frames per second, when I import it into Final Cut Pro, it automatically drops it to 24 frames per second. So what I will do instead is I will put a link in the description to the clip on YouTube so you can click on it and see for yourself. When you watch it, you'll notice that everything is a little strange, that the animations look weird, that everything, it almost looks like it's filmed with an iPhone or a cell phone rather than filmed with a movie camera. The whole cinematic, filmic look to the movie is gone when it's at 60 frames per second.
Okay, but then again, that's a movie, and that might be true for a movie. A movie might not be great in 60 frames a second, just like how a game isn't great at 24 frames a second. Movies and games are two completely different things, and both run at completely different optimal frame rates. Why are we trying to make a game like a movie? It's meant to be a video game, it's not meant to be a movie. Also, with this whole filmic look or whatever at 24 FPS, why not just make the cutscenes in 24 FPS? You look at a game like Left 4 Dead 2, you boot up that game, the cutscene, the intro cutscene has that filmic feel at 24 FPS, but as soon as you get into the game, you get 300 FPS. A lot of games do this. They'll have the frame rate of the cutscenes go down to 30 or 24 FPS to give you that filmic feel, but as soon as you get back into the game, they realize that obviously frame rate is really important in games, and the higher the better, so they'll bump you back up to 60, 120, 300, whatever. There's actually a video on this where a guy tries to play Red Dead 2 at 24 FPS, and it's fucking miserable.
This is the same issue that I have playing video games. When I play some of these games at 60 frames per second, they lose that cinematic feel.
But is that cinematic feel worth having the worst possible input lag and having every time you rotate the camera be nauseating? 24 FPS is fine for movies, I'm not denying that, but this is a game. This is not a movie. 24 FPS in a game is, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, fucking unplayable.
I also think a lot of gamers are being very unrealistic with their expectations going into the next generation.
Oh, no, let me stop you right there. They told us to expect better performance this generation than last generation. And when you tell us to expect better performance, guess what? We are going to expect better performance. We expect our next generation console to play like a next generation console. Not only were we told to expect better performance, but we also paid extra for these consoles, and now we are paying extra for games. If I'm paying extra for these games and these consoles, I want them to perform better. What am I paying for? Obviously the better performance.
It seems that gamers on both sides, more so on the Xbox side because it is the more powerful machine, but gamers on both sides expect games next gen to all run at native 4K with real-time ray tracing for shadows and reflections and extremely dense, detailed environments and all the bells and whistles, and do it all at a minimum of 60 frames per second.
Well, I mean, they marketed these consoles as 4K 60 consoles, and I don't really care about the ray tracing and all that, but you come out and you say they're 4K 60 consoles, give us 4K 60, and some games do. Doom Eternal does it, Call of Duty does it, a ton of other games do it. But the problem is we're getting games come out at 30 frames a second, upscaled 1080p 30. That's not what we fucking paid for. Is it really unrealistic for us to expect what we were told to expect by the companies, advertising these consoles? No. If you come out and you tell us that 4K 60 is the standard, then guess what? 4K 60 is the fucking standard, and it's not unrealistic to expect the standard that you set.
And I think that is just unrealistic. I think they're expecting way too much of these machines.
Okay, let me ask you all something. Is it unrealistic for me to expect my next generation PlayStation 5 to run better than my PlayStation 2 when it comes to performance? No, that's not unrealistic. Stop bootlicking.
In order to do all of these things, there's gonna be sacrifices that have to be made somewhere. And those sacrifices are either gonna be made in resolution, frames per second, or the actual details inside of the game itself.
And that's why, to PlayStation's credit, they give you the option in a lot of games. You can lower the resolution to get 60 FPS, you can lower the details to get 60 FPS, and I truly appreciate them doing that because I don't like 30 FPS. And I don't think I make it a secret that I don't like 30 FPS. I mean, how many videos have I made shitting on 30 FPS? And if you guys want me to keep doing it, I'll keep doing it.
We can have graphically intensive games that push the GPUs and use real-time ray tracing and all the bells and whistles and crazy new tech of the next generation. We can have games with high frame rates, we can have games with high resolutions, but we can't have all three at the same time. Somewhere sacrifices are going to be made.
Yeah, and only one of those three things listed actually affects the gameplay. And guess what? That thing that affects the gameplay isn't the ray traced shadows, it isn't the resolution, it's the frame rate. So why make the sacrifice on the one thing that affects the very thing that makes a video game, the gameplay?
Sometimes sacrifices are going to be resolution, sometimes the sacrifices are going to be frame rate, and sometimes the sacrifices are going to be the things that we see on screen.
That's not true. When is it ever the resolution that gets sacrificed for a better frame rate? It isn't, and the reason for that is because it's easier to market a higher resolution to people who don't even play games.
And it would appear that most developers, when deciding where they're going to make sacrifices, are choosing to do it in the frames per second department.
Yeah, and guess what? We don't like that. We don't like when you choose to sacrifice the one thing that affects gameplay instead of some fucking ray traced shadows or a higher resolution that isn't even a true 4K. And I'll admit, a lot of games give you the option to choose what you want to sacrifice, whether it be resolution, frame rate, ray tracing, whatever. And I truly applaud them for that. I think it is a very good thing to do to allow us to choose what we want to sacrifice. But it's very annoying when they come out and choose to sacrifice the one thing that affects the gameplay, the very thing that makes a video game a video game. We're not here to watch a movie, we're here to play a video game.
Because they rather keep all of the detailed environments and the ray tracing and all the other great shit in the game, and they would also like to keep the higher resolution so they have that much more detailed, crisper looking image. The developer's main goal is to make the best looking game possible, not the smoothest running game possible.
And that's where developers are 100% out of touch, because everywhere I check online, every poll, every study shows that people prefer a better running game, a better feeling game, rather than a better looking game. Why don't these developers come out and ask us, the consumers, the ones that basically pay their livelihoods, what we would rather? Or they could do what a lot of developers do and just give us the option.
If that makes sense. Now, I'm sure there are devs who are going to prioritize smoothness over anything else, and they're going to target that 60 frames per second, and that's going to be mandatory for the game they are trying to make. And those are primarily going to be your first-person shooters, racing games, and fighting games.
By the way, I just want to say, shout out to those devs, I appreciate the fuck out of you. And a lot of those devs that target high frame rates, they don't get their games running at 60, they get them running at 120. Doom Eternal, 120 FPS. Call of Duty, 120 FPS, and you can play them in 1440p too. Say what you want about Call of Duty and the direction Call of Duty is going in. The people who optimize that game, they're skilled at their job. The people who optimize Doom Eternal, they're skilled at their job.
But I think all the other games, the third-person action adventure games, your Uncharted's, your Spider-Man's, your Horizon Zero Dawn's, your Fable, if they actually finally unveil Fable, games like that. I think that developers are going to target making the game look as good as possible, not necessarily run as smooth as possible. And let's get real for a second. Playing games at 30 frames per second doesn't feel bad.
No, the input lag is very noticeable. Now, you can still enjoy playing games at 30 FPS, that's fine. I love Bloodborne, it runs at 30 FPS, but 30 FPS does not feel good.
I've never once played a game running at 30 frames per second and thought to myself, fuck man, this game is clunky and slow as shit because it's 30 frames per second.
Play a first-person shooter in 30 FPS. Play Redfall when it was in 30 FPS. I know they patched it later. But play a first-person shooter in 30 FPS and come back to me and say that same thing. The only way you wouldn't notice the fact that your abilities are being limited in a first-person shooter at 30 FPS is if you fucking suck.
Nah, the game felt fine. Do they feel smoother at 60 frames per second? Of course, but is it a huge, massive deal? Fuck no.
In a first-person shooter, it's a big deal. In a fast-paced game that requires quick actions or parry timings, it is. In a racing game, it's a big deal.
Now, I know those of you who play a lot of online multiplayer first-person shooters are screaming at me in the comments, and listen, I get it, I understand. When it comes to playing first-person shooters online competitively, 60 frames per second should be the minimum because of how much better it is and how much better your reaction times can be and how much smoother everything runs. I totally get it.
Not only first-person online shooters, but also just shooters in general. I don't want to be dying in a first-person shooter, even if it's an offline game, due to a low frame rate. Doom Eternal is an offline shooter, but it would not be okay for that game to be running in 30 frames a second. In fact, you know, I'm someone who's beaten a lot of the levels on the Ultra Nightmare mode. I would not have been able to do that at 30 frames a second, and I know that for a fact.
I understand. So for first-person shooters, like I said, and fighting games and racing games, I think it should be 60 frames per second.
No, any game that requires good timing needs 60 frames a second. Any game that has like parrying, anything like that, is gonna require 60 frames a second because we don't want input lag on challenging timings. The only games that I can accept being locked to 30 FPS are games that don't require precise timing, like Pokemon or whatever, and like a Telltale game. If your game requires parrying and any sort of precise timing, it needs to run at 60. Obviously, I'm talking about next gen here. If it's on the Switch, whatever, run it at 30.
But for everything else, I have zero issue with them running at 30 frames per second.
If your standards are lower, that's completely fine. However, the rest of us here, you know, we heard when they told us to expect better performance, and we did. We do expect better performance. If you're okay with 30, whatever, go ahead, have fun. But the thing is, a lot of us are upset because we were told we'd be getting 60, we were told we'd be getting 120, and here we are getting a lot of games come out with a locked 30 with no way to increase it.
And that, like I said, to me personally, in most cases, I would prefer it. If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30.
You would rather play a game with 4 times the input lag just so it could have a cinematic feel to it. You would prefer to play at 30. You would prefer to play at 30 frames a second over 120. Oh my god, dude. Holy shit. I'm done. I'm fucking done, dude. I quit. I'm done with YouTube. Fucking done, bro. Fucking. I would still rather the game running at 30 over 100. Who actually says that? Like, unironically says shit. What the fuck is wrong with that? No, but if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and I know it came across a little bit harsh on people who prefer a better looking game over a better playing game. Once again, this is not an attack against you. I know it came across a little bit harsh in the video, but it's all to be funny, right? Like, I'm just trying to make people laugh. And yeah, I'm out of here.
If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30.
Alright, that's all I gotta say for today. Have a great day, guys.